Sorry for the late start. Our technical difficulties are resolved. My name is Nick Zeller. I brought some, but not all of my voice with me today. Sorry. My doppelganger, John Gibbons, is in the room.
I'm the evil one because I have the beard.
Welcome to this event put on by the China Research Center, China Focus, and I believe Georgia State University as well.
Atlanta Global Studies Center.
And as well as Atlanta Global Studies.
Ethan is right here.
That's me,
Atlanta Global Studies Center.
Nice to meet you.
My main job is actually just to plug China Focus things before the meeting begins. And that's very easy. All of China Focus everywhere on the internet is USCNPM at whatever. So we have Substack, uscnpm.substack.com. You can find us on LinkedIn with those 6 letters. You can find us on Instagram with those 6 letters. And if you're still using Twitter, stop. If you're not going to stop, you can also find us on Twitter at USCNPM. We've got 3 panelists today. Abbos Bobohonov, head of the Asia Pacific Studies Center at the Institute for Advanced International Studies and Fulbright visiting scholar at Georgia State University. Very happy to have him. He has made an amazing 2-part interview on our website, which is, you might guess, uscnpm.org. It's also on our Substack, and there's not a lot of good info about Central Asia and China out there. So Abbos is really, there's nobody running against him. It's great. We're very happy to have him in Atlanta. That interview is fantastic, and we'll hear more from him today. We have Igor Patrick with us today, here promoting his new book. Yes, can you hold up a copy of your book, please? Hearts and Minds, Votes and Contracts. Yes?
You brought us copies, which is amazing. So
brought copies for everybody who could show up in person. And I'm very excited to read it, out through the Wilson Center and the Kissinger Institute. And last but not least, we have Maria Repnikova, Associate Professor in Global Communications at Georgia State University. In order, they will be talking about China and Central Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Africa. Yes, Ethiopia.
Right.
Our discussion will be moderated by somebody who brought all of their voice with them today. Not me, you don't have to listen to me for that much longer. Penny Prime, founding member of the China Research Center, I was going to say an Atlanta institution, but an all Georgia institution. Yes?
Sure.
China folks need a network everywhere they are, and Penny Prime has helped provide that. I don't have anything else to say. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I will hush.
Okay, so let's start with Maria. We'll go in the order that we have here.
Great.
And we'll have remarks from each of them, and then some discussion among the panel and the participants after that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to the Carter Center for hosting, for organizing, and to the Atlanta Global Studies Center. Ethan has been a great partner in making this event happen, especially for bringing Igor to us, to Atlanta. I've been excited to meet him for a long time because he was in DC, but I wasn't in DC at the time, and I missed his book launch. So now we get to have like a mini book launch with the book. And we have graduate students here and other faculty who I hope will also use it in their classes and promote the book. So I'm really excited. And Abbos, of course, is my current co-partner in studying Central Asia. He's here for a semester. We've known each other for a while. He's doing some great research on the region. Again, as Nick mentioned, a really unique voice on a region that doesn't get a lot of attention, enough attention. It's very important, but we don't have enough experts. So I'm really happy that he's here. And I'll talk a little bit today, just very briefly, about some core strategies that I see Chinese state and state-affiliated actors as using and influencing the media landscape. In Africa, I'm drawing from my research on Ethiopia, but I'm also making some broader points about the African context and global South context. And we have here with us also Solomon, who is a PhD student at Georgia State, who's studying this issue in a really detailed manner across different African countries. So I really hope he'll also contribute to the discussion further on. So the 3 strategies I wanted to bring out, 3 tactics that I think will also reverberate across different contexts are the material, ideation, ideological, and sensorial reach. So these are the 3 strategies I also use and analyze in my book with regards to broader image-making efforts by China in Africa. But I'm only going to talk about the media here today. So I will talk about the three strategies and also a little bit about the effects. What do they mean? What are the implications of these strategies? So the first is the material, right? We often think about media as a very ideological kind of enterprise, telling China stories, reaching people through narratives. But there's also a big outreach through money, right? Through tangible means. So what are these tangible means? There's several core examples. One example is, of course, training and inviting journalists for free trips, so access to China, experiences in China. These can be very short-term experiences, or they can be very much long-term, multiple months and even 10-month fellowships for African journalists. And again, this is something that I've observed in Ethiopia across different media institutions, which was really striking to me just how widespread this is. There are state outlets, state-affiliated outlets, regional outlets, and national outlets that are being exposed to these various trips, from short to long-term trips that are really fundamental in building relationships with these journalists. In addition to these trips and exchanges, there's also the strategy of providing content for free. So Xinhua News Agency in particular signs agreements with major state news agencies across Africa, but in Ethiopia, it's the main news agency, Ethiopian news agency is called ENA, and basically provides free content. So one can use this content from the news agency and disseminate the China stories about Africa and about China for free. Why is this important? Because other outlets like Reuters and AEP are very costly. So instead of subscribing to them and paying a high fee, one can get a free, essentially, news service from Xinhua. So this is something that I think is becoming more and more significant. And we have also with us here Narmin, who is another PhD student who's studying some of this in the Caucasus, and it's becoming a really big strategy, providing free content. One can say, who cares? But actually, it's important because these news outlets end up using the content. So as a result, they rely on Chinese content to tell China stories because it's too expensive, too costly, too resource intensive and time intensive to report on China independently. So it's actually really important in terms of its influence. And the other more kind of subtle strategies are providing media infrastructure. So for instance, building an actual building, the office of a news outlet, or providing furniture for a news outlet, or technological kind of equipment. All of that is more subtle, very difficult to track without interview data, but we can really see it in the Ethiopian case that it was sometimes mentioned very much offhand. Hey, by the way, the building was built by a Chinese company. Sometimes it's a gift, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's a loan-based infrastructure agreement, but the furniture and technology is usually a gift. So it's just something that kind of fills up the room, the space, typically comes from the provisions of Chinese embassy. So the various kind of technological material enticements that really underpin, I think, they're kind of at the core, the foundation of China's media outreach in Africa. And the second key tool here is more ideological, right? So again, kind of storytelling. So I started out with that as often being assumed to be the core tool, but it is one of the tools. I think it's one of the mechanisms. How does this work? How do we analyze this? We can analyze it through different means. One of them is just by looking at how Chinese media reports the stories about China-Africa relations. Mostly my understanding and analysis of these stories, as well as the analysis by other scholars, demonstrates predominantly pro-China reporting. Not surprisingly, very positive framing. China as a helper, as an assistant, as an ally of Africa and Africans, as well as China's success story. So China is very successful, inspirational, and it's also providing something very helpful for Africa. And increasingly, we also see anti-Western themes kind of spread through or kind of trickle through these reporting. So the West is weaker or less effective, and China is stronger and more persuasive and effective as a partner. So that's kind of the storytelling we see in the media. But I think the more maybe interesting to me, at least, is a storytelling that takes place also through trainings. So when journalists come on those trips, what do they actually learn and grasp from these experiences? And unlike the kind of debates we often see in Washington that suggest that there is an export of sort of authoritarianism and censorship, I see more so kind of a diffusion of successful, basically, stories about China. So not so much of like, here's how we censor the media, here's how we, work in terms of our ideology and so forth. It's more so, here's how successful we are when it comes to digitalization of the media. Here's how productive or successful or high-tech our media is. So showing off as opposed to kind of training in a very kind of concrete way is what I observed from my interview data. But also just, exposing people to China, the success stories, the innovation, the civilizational kind of narrative about Chinese culture. Those kind of more maybe amorphous but important themes about just what China has accomplished and has accomplished are actually more significant than just training about the media. So journalists come away, in my view, with a softened perspective about China. So not so much transformed, but softening perspective, especially about Chinese governance. So China teaches its participants, or the participants in trainings, that China is a democracy, and very effective democracy. And even though they don't buy into this fully, they still come away thinking, well, maybe it has its own approach. Maybe it is it has its own way. And that's already much softer than saying that China is just not a democracy. So coming out, to China and seeing that, in my view, it ends up softening the perceptions. And I think that's also a really important effect of these kind of ideological experiences or trainings. And the third tool here that I wanted to mention is censorship. So again, we kind of hear a little bit about censorship and sometimes in very dramatic examples. For example, there was a case in South Africa with a Chinese company investing in a local news outlet, and as a result, the editorial policy about Xinjiang changed. So they were not able to publish a story that was critical about Chinese government policy in Xinjiang. That's kind of an extreme case, and I haven't observed so much of this direct effect from through kind of ownership in the case of Ethiopia, but I have observed subtle censorship. That's very significant. So what does subtle censorship mean? It means controlling how information about China and Chinese activities is being disseminated. So this means that most of this information is being spread through very contrived and controlled public relations briefings. So it means there's a spectacle, there's an event that celebrates the opening or the initiative or the new idea that's being promoted, but you cannot ask questions, you cannot be too spontaneous about how you engage in the event. Everything is very top-down, structured in a very regimented way. And outside of that, information is often just being refused. So if a journalist comes and asks a question, even if it's about a story that's relatively positive or even celebratory of China, most of the time they get a response that's a non-response. They're just not available for an interview, not interested in the interview. They're just not available. So it's kind of like a silencing tactic. So one can say, is this really censorship? You know, they're not telling you what to say, but if you can't access information, you also can't really tell a comprehensive story. So in my view, it still fits a broader definition of censorship or kind of censorial power. And in addition to this kind of systematic ways of not giving information, some officials and company representatives also engage in kind of ad hoc practices of just co-opting, trying to offer a bribe, or threatening a journalist and telling them, don't publish this or else I'm going to tell your government ministry and you're going to get in trouble. These tactics are used as a threatening kind of mechanism, and these tactics are very similar to how Chinese government and various entities within the government censor media domestically. It's not something that's kind of revolutionary in terms of external governance. We see this domestically as well. This kind of contrived PR settings and ways of spreading information, but also myriad forms of censorship take place in a more ad hoc kind of improvised manner. So in some ways, it's sort of like adopting domestic strategies and exporting them, I guess, overseas, and how Chinese entities engage in information management. So in my last minute or so, I just want to talk a little bit about the effects. You know, what do we think about, make of these implications of these various mechanisms or approaches? So I think in some ways, these approaches altogether kind of make for a relatively, I think, important influence when it comes to shaping information environment on the ground. Ethiopia, of course, is in some ways a unique case, in some ways less so, but the unique part is that it's also very authoritarian. The media itself is very controlled domestically, so it's easier in some ways to kind of have further influence in this particular context. But there are also many semi-autocratic regimes around the world that are part of the broader global south region. So in some ways, maybe that's less of a unique case than we might imagine, but it's certainly not a democracy. So that's something that we can keep in mind when we think about the analysis. But when we look at these various techniques and kind of just look at the effects separately, material effects, first of all, most of the participants I engage with, they do accept the offerings. So they don't decline, they don't say, oh, I'm not comfortable with accepting the furniture or the technology or the trip. Most of them say yes. They will take the offerings. Why? Because the competing powers, West in particular, in broad terms, the US, Western Europe, are not really offering anything similar. So for them, there's no other alternative option. So it's like, well, if we're going to get some technology, it's going to be China. If we're going to get to go on a trip, just overseas, just to go somewhere outside of Ethiopia or Africa, it's going to be China, because that's the only offering kind of actor in this case. So the acceptance, I think, is already the first step towards engagement. When it comes to ideational, reach, so promoting China's ideals, as I mentioned earlier, there is a softening in perceptions. So even if people are not completely convinced by what China is saying, there's still some degree of kind of acknowledgement of China's story. And I think that in and of itself is significant. And as we're working on a separate project with Solomon, we're also looking at how these journalists actually produce content about China for Chinese media as well as for local media as a result, or as kind of part of this training. So they actually end up producing a lot of pro-China content. They become kind of the speakers for China as part of these experiences, which is also very significant because if we think about China's discourse power, having the right to speak in the international system, it now has kind of discourse agents, so to speak, delegating its discourse power creation to African journalists, and I think more broadly global South journalists. It's also a significant effect. So it's not just kind of liking China, but producing content about China that's very positive in Chinese media. And I think we found that China Daily was one of the outlets, but also Xinhua and CGTN, that we see a lot of content produced by African journalists, and most overarching, it's very positive. So that's another effect. And then lastly, with censorship, in the context of Ethiopia, we often think about censorship as the reaction is either kind of sort of surrender, there's pure control, surrender, or resistance. But in the case of Ethiopia, there's complicity. So the officials in public relations offices, as well as journalists and state media, tend to be very much complicit in terms of co-censoring what China is doing because they're afraid of losing out on China's interests in terms of economic engagements. So they're actually engaging in very active censorial practices themselves. They really try to discipline how China is talked about, promote Chinese initiatives, and not raise sensitive questions. So that's another kind of effect that I think is really significant, and collaboration basically being kind of co-opted or appropriating Chinese censorship power as opposed to actively resisting it or being fully suppressed by it. They see it as being in Ethiopia's interest. So those are the kind of effects that we see. I can also talk about later in discussion about some of the maybe weaknesses in this approach and what China is not getting or the kind of deficiencies in its strategies. But I just wanted to first bring up what it's doing and some of the more powerful impact when it comes to creating relationships as well as complicit narratives about China. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Let's have Abbos go next.
Dear colleagues, participants, and guests, first of all, let me introduce me. So I'm introduced by Dr. Zeller. Just want to a little bit, first of all, express my gratitude to Carter Center and to my supervisor, Dr. Repnikova, for her supporting me. And without her support, I'm not be here and can opportunity to share with you my opinions and my research results. As you know, mass media becoming today somewhat like fool as it did in 20th century. Media becomes more important to influencer factor all over the world. So that's why today would like to share with my opinions on China policy, media policy in Central Asia, because last 5 years, China becoming more important and significant factor in Central Asian countries, and that's why media role of China also increasing, because when I provide some kind of research, many experts and journalists said, despite of China increasing economical role, political role, the image still is like three. And China also understand this because under the Belt and Road initiatives, also 10 years they provide his economical opportunities, economical chances. So, but they image, they position, and on the social level still is bad, still is not positive. So that's why China last 5 years paying attention more in media policy. Why? Because they want to improve his image, his brand as a positive. So that's why this topic is more important, I think. So I divided two parts my speech. First is I would like to say something, what kind of policy China provides in Central Asia. As second, more narrowly, I want to tell something, what kind of media policies they provide in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, because they more focused in these two countries, because Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan more potential in Central Asia. They can change any situation in Central Asia. They have a not only political, they have only economic potential, and they have potential to create the positive impressions. So that's why they focused on, China focused on more Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Finally, I would like to summarize the key features of China media discourse and analyze its implications for Central Asian countries. So during the period 2014, after announcement of Belt and Road, before pandemic, China faced various challenges such as Uyghur issues, protests in Hong Kong, COVID-19, and Xinjiang issues, which is more impacted the impressions in Central Asian society. So consequently, China authorities took serious steps to enhance their image, especially in neighboring countries in Central Asia. One of the measures China undertook was to establish connection with the media structures that's in media level. So as China's economic presence and investment intensified along with its international ambitions, the concept of China's spread, significantly damaging China's image abroad, particularly in neighboring countries. These factors prompt China to pay special attention to media tools. It's like Telegram channels, Facebook, TikTok, and so on. Building a positive image in developing countries will assist China in the garnering more supporters for its initiatives in international forums and achieving its economic goals. Shaping a positive discourse enables China not only to systematically pursue its objectives within the Belt and Road Initiative, but also to open previously closed doors, including by expanding the sphere of loyal states particularly in Central Asia. At present, China has adapted its media strategy through three primary methods. Firstly, it has intensified the dissemination of its messages quantitatively to counter the international image crisis stemming from criticism related to the perception of the China Street, Xinjiang, and others. Secondly, the content of its messages has become more diverse as its deliverability sought to link Xinjiang policy with international terrorism, while also using it for broader critiques of Western double standards and promoting its own views on human rights. Thirdly, and notably, it has employed innovative and creative ways of conveying information to achieve greater impact and credibility. CGTN has long emulated the style of CNN and BBC to carve out its own content niche. However, Chinese media products have become more diversified in recent times due to the wider use of social networks. China utilizes online operations, audiovisual production, and traditional media such as newspaper and news channels. According to data in 2021, it controls over 3,000 state television channels worldwide and more than 150 paid television channels, around 2,500 radio stations, about 2,000 newspapers and 10,000 magazines, as well as over 3 million websites. So, in particular, China's media policy in Central Asia is considered in the region of vital interests, upon the security of which its own well-being depends. China's interest in Central Asia is driven by its favorable geographical position, abundant natural resources, and in recent years, its geostrategic importance, including as a key continental hub for transport corridors. Moreover, the security of western regions of China, which is proximate Central Asia, is a crucial factor in China's long-term interests in the region. The first Prime Minister of China, Zhou Enlai, emphasized the need for China to gain the trust of developing countries before it can hope to influence their policies. Xi Jinping's introduction of the long-term Belt and Road Initiative strategy in 2013, and in one sense, the Russian-European crisis due to Crimea in 2014 provided China with direct access to interaction with Central Asian countries. Today, China has reached institutionalization in Central Asia through the formats of Belt and Road, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and last one is Central Asian 5 and plus China. And this formats enabling China to closer monitor the political connection of Central Asian countries. Content analysis of the three leading China's publications China Daily, People's Daily, Global Times reveals a moderate interest in publications about Central Asia. Typically, the volume of such information increased before official visits by China officials or presidents from Central Asian countries to China. While during the regular times, China publications mainly report on significant political events regarding Central Asian countries. When I researched these three media platforms, when organized the official visits in May month or in October, that time China media platforms also activated more information in newspapers, analytical information, so on. So in other times, it's very less information on Central Asian issues. And who information is also in official information, not kind of official information about visits, about some kind of activities, political activities. When I analyzed the 5 major internet publications in Uzbekistan, Podrobnus, Kunuz, Gazeta, Dario, and Spotus. So it shows a significant increase in publications, information about China in local media, because China becoming our main economic partner, main investment partner, main trade partner. That's why information has becoming also increasing. In Kazakhstan media also such as very similar situations. Last 2 years, China media, Kazakh media also increasing information about China. Several future defines China media policy in Central Asia. First, the China government and pro-government structures actively collaborate with similar governmental media entities in Central Asia. Key forms of cooperation include content exchange, paid material placement, editorial sponsorship, financial support, and loyal journalists, organization press tours, educational trips to China, Central Asian journalists. Second, heightened attention to media from China's top leaderships. Notably, under the previous leaders, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, they don't give more attention to media platform, but in Xi Jinping period, they become more increasing attention to media platforms. And also Xi Jinping also becoming to more spread his information, his speeches, his articles in Central Asian media platforms. So third, cooperation with the local media outlets. Last 5 years, increasing signing some documents with the Central Asia media and China media platforms. So if we analyze last 2 years, more than 10 documents signed between China media platforms and Central Asia media platforms. So first, focusing on establishing contacts with the local journalists and academic experts. China divided Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Why? In Uzbekistan, China more focused on journalists cooperation. In Kazakhstan, they attention more focused on experts, because Kazakh experts has own platforms, Telegram channels, Facebook, and another social media platforms, which is helped China to increase his positive image in the sociality and social level. So 5 is China more focused on training our journalists. Journalists from Central Asian countries more focused on Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So 6, regarding the role of China's diplomatic representatives and embassies is very active, becoming more active. China embassy organizes so many events and every time they involving media platforms, they spread more information in social level and political level. 7, there is a focus on showcasing China economic potential. So they aim not only cooperate with the journalists, they also want to spread his economic potential through our journalists. The more important fact, the media policy also is economic fact. So last one is China intensifying efforts to institutionalize its presence, its striving establish regular connection with the media structures in Central Asian countries. In 2023, they organized big media event between China and Central Asia, and that time they come to agreement to organize this event, media platform events regularly. And that time, recently, in Xinjiang, they organized such kind of media meetings. So it becomes more regular. So due to time limitations, I also would like to say about
We can get to the discussion.
limitations, maybe.
Yeah, we can talk about limitations in discussion because I didn't bring up limitations either, so we can all talk about it together
Okay.
after Igor presents.
Okay, the two main positive and negative factors. As a
Okay, 1 minute.
And as a positive scenario, if China continues to moderate media policy in the medium long term, strategically disseminating its own content and conducting activities to enhance its image among regional population without interfering in internal affairs. If current leaders in Central Asian countries maintain control over the society, then Central Asia will likely continue to positive interaction with China, ultimately strengthening their relations. Therefore, in the medium to long term, China's policy towards Central Asia isn't expected to undergo significant chances. In negative scenario, if the current authorities, regional states, feel media pressure from China in the future, leading to uncontrollable public discontent that threatens the stability of their power. And if China is unable to improve its image in the region, relations between China and the governments of Central Asian states could face a crisis or maximum strain. This could fundamentally alter China's role in the region and create significant uncertainty for China's policy towards Central Asian countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll get back to some of your other points. So Igor, your turn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. As I was telling Maria, I don't get to talk about this, even though I spent 5 years of my life researching about it. I also feel that like a lot of things that I plan to talk today, I think you already covered, and you're gonna see that you're quoted multiple times in the book. I think like in the big picture, like what they are doing in Latin America is very similar to what they're doing in Africa. So you also get like the sponsored trips, you also get like the infrastructure deals. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about what is different, and I think people don't pay much attention to. So indeed, like when I got interested in researching about Chinese state media, and when I was trying to do like literature review, for example, I would only find materials on like the China media in Africa, because I think there's a lot of like scholarship on this already, but like on Latin America, not really. And trying to understand this, I just want to explain a little bit on how the media market works in Latin America. I think what I constantly saw, like during like my literature reviewing for the book and before like for my master's thesis as well, is that like in Africa, for example, you have situations like in some countries where you have the so-called news deserts, like places that are not covered by any media outlet. So Chinese media outlets were more than happy to fill this gap. There are also like countries that didn't have proper infrastructure to broadcast, for example, content in Chinese state media was also very much happy to offer them to perhaps like use the infrastructure together as long as like a specific country would grant access to them. This is not the case in Latin America. Latin America has one of the most concentrated media markets in the world, if not the most concentrated media market. Most of these media companies, they're owned by people who inherited money from agribusiness. And please remember this term here, agribusiness, because this is going to be a key factor when I start like talking how they managed to sign so many content sharing agreements with media outlets in Latin America. So they started like signing content sharing agreements. I think like much earlier than anyone saw like paying attention to this. I was actually surprised when I started like researching about it. I managed to find contracts dating back all the way until like 1991, for example. Yeah, in Argentina, I believe actually like this case in Argentina, a content sharing agreement with the state news agency there, and Telan. It was probably the first one that they signed on like this model of content sharing agreement. But I think like at that time, they were mostly reaching out, first of all, like to other state media. So in this case of Argentina, there is a very fine line in Latin America between state media and public media, but it's still like they were first reaching out to these so-called low-hanging fruits. Later, they moved to media outlets that are sort of like ideology similar to China. So like media outlets that are like associated with communist parties or like left-wing parties. And then eventually they started like reaching out to like commercial media. And I could trace this back to when Xi Jinping first spoke about the need to tell China's story as well, right? Like a model that you see constantly when you research about this. But I mean, like in Africa, because like there is this news desert and also like many media outlets, they lack the infrastructure. Most of the times, like in several regions, and please correct me if I'm wrong because that's not my area of expertise, but like in several regions across Africa, you would have like places where like CGTN perhaps is one of the few, perhaps the only channel that you can access. That's not the case in Latin America, but the channels that are already well established there, they do try their best to prevent competition. So when they first arrived, and you know, like CGTN brags about the fact that like their signal is available in 140 plus countries. Yes, you can access CGTN in Brazil or in Argentina, in Mexico, in Colombia, but you also have access to CNN, to Deutsche Welle, to like many other well-established Western brands. So CGTN, like they still have CGTN Spanish, and I would say it's mostly for diplomatic reasons. They want to say they have a channel in a UN language, but it's not effective. Most people don't follow at all, and those who follow, like there is this professor at the London School of Economics, a good friend of mine, also quoted several times in this book, Pablo Morales, and he did several focus groups in Mexico. And something very interesting that he found, that I also found in Brazil, is that people tend to not trust news coming from CGTN in Spanish because they use the Spanish accent. And for many people in Latin America, this sort of accent is sort of like associated with colonialism, right? So they would say, okay, so like they're trying to talk to me, like why are they using the so-called standard Spanish, you know? So that's one of the reasons. And then also like because these media are concentrated, like it would be very difficult to compete with narratives. Mind that most of these journalists and the media owners, they have very solid bonds with the US and the Western in general. Most of them were educated here, and they tend to reproduce Western values. So it's not so easy. So for example, like Globo, for example, I worked for them before. It was mandatory for us to refuse any sort of like sponsored trip from any state. Like it's absolutely out of question. Other like smaller media outlets that don't have resources might perhaps like agree to do it, but like in big, like the ones that matter actually, they wouldn't allow it. So I think the way they did it was very, very clever. And I don't think people here in the US pay much attention to this. So instead of like spending like millions of dollars trying to build like CGTN in Spanish in Latin America, matter of fact, they tried to make CGTN in Spanish in Brazil, I think, but it never took off because like, of course, Brazilians don't speak Spanish. But also like in general, I think there's also like an image, an identity crisis in Brazil in terms of like recognizing as part of Latin America or not. CNN tried the same thing like a few years ago. They actually like stopped broadcasting the English channel to make this CNN Espanol more popular. And they actually noticed that people are actually dropping CNN altogether instead of like following CNN in Spanish. And then eventually they start like broadcasting in English. So they never like, when they started like expanding CGTN, that was in 2016, right? When they rebranded. They talked about like opening a branch in Brazil because they already have a big CCTV office in São Paulo covering Latin America in general for Chinese TV. But they noticed that they would never be able to compete with like the local players. So yes, the first thing they did was like to offer these content sharing agreements, and it was very limited because, yeah, from time to time, if you have like something very specific that you wouldn't be able to get from like Western news agencies, yeah, you can use some images from Xinhua or CGTN, but in general, no, you wouldn't do it because you cannot verify how they got that information. You cannot like attest that what they are broadcasting is true. So most media outlets, they would just ditch the content. So yeah, so they offered, it was there, but it never really took off until the pandemic. During the pandemic, most Latin American, not most, all of Latin American countries, they didn't have a correspondent in China. This is a big issue. Now we have three, two from Brazil, two friends of mine actually, and another one that is from Cuba. But it's still like, so there was a legit demand from the audience for news coming from China, especially because like there was this new virus. People are saying that if you get it, you're going to die, but like we don't know exactly what's going on in China. So how do you do this? And this combined with like very strict visa policies gave the Chinese leverage in outsourcing their content. So this TV channel that I just mentioned that prohibit us from like accepting sponsored trips, yes, they do, but they did broadcast a whole CGTN documentary called 24 Hours in Wuhan. Matter of fact, a very good documentary, by the way. But they never told viewers that this was a Chinese-made program by a Chinese state media. And when I started like analyzing cases across Latin America, that seems to be the standard. Like those media outlets, they don't tell, or like the way they do it is not clear enough for the reader or the viewer to understand, to distinguish content. And the Chinese, they know about this. So in Mexico, for example, I was just talking to Nick earlier, and I was telling about this case in Mexico where like the second biggest newspaper in Mexico, they have these content sharing agreements. They get like $50,000 per page that they publish of the People's Daily there in Spanish. And the Chinese are now designing their page to look like the rest of the newspaper. So like, yeah, readers wouldn't be able to distinguish. And then there was a situation where, and that happened like basically 5 days before I arrived in Mexico for my research. I was talking to the international desk editor, and she was like, well, a few days ago, I got this scoop from Human Rights Watch. They managed to find a tweet of the Mexican envoy to the mission, the UN mission in Switzerland. She went to Xinjiang together with the Cuban ambassador without telling Mexico City she was doing that, and he tweeted about it. So she got the lead from Human Rights Watch, and she was writing the story. As the newspaper was ready to print, the owner of the newspaper called her, and he was like, why are you publishing this? And she was like, well, it's news. Like her ambassador is doing stuff in China, in a highly contested region of China, full of abuses and human rights abuses, and like people here, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, don't know about it. And he was like, well, no one in Mexico cares about random Muslims in China, but if you publish this, we're going to lose this contract. This is paying for half of your salaries. She ended up like publishing like a very like watered version of the original story. In Argentina, the way they did it is so clever because they started like doing these partnerships with media outlets. They're linked to Cristina Kirchner, the left-wing president a few years ago. That was right after Argentina signed a comprehensive partnership agreement with China. Then when Cristina Kirchner left power and Mauricio Macri rose to the presidency, Mauricio Macri, for those who don't know, is more right-leaning. Those media outlets, the right-leaning media outlets in Argentina who make like a lot of money opposing the Kirchner government, they were losing audience because like they were pretty much reproducing what the government was doing instead of like being actual opposition to power. So when they noticed that the right-leaning media outlets, they were like losing revenue and losing subscribers, and they were like truly in a crisis to keep running the newspapers, they reach out to them as well, to the point that today in Argentina, pretty much every single legacy media outlet in Argentina has some sort of partnership with the Chinese. When they celebrated the anniversary of the relations like 2 years ago, they had a whole section of the newspaper with like stories produced by CGTN, letters from the ambassador, letters from Wang Yi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And you can see in the comment section people asking, that's a bit odd because like it feels like you're doing propaganda to China. Why? Because there is no indication that that was like paid by the Chinese, you know? In Brazil, Bungie, and this is actually how I got interested in this topic because I saw Bungie advertising this chief position there for a China reporter, and I was like, wow, great, like this is a big TV network. This is sort of what I've been doing for the past 10 years. And I applied, and then when I got a reply back to like schedule an interview and like answer some questions, the email came from CCTV. And I was like, that's a bit weird. And then I noticed that like they were actually running a whole segment at primetime newscasts, 15 minutes long, called Mundo China or China World, where they would basically get stories from CCTV. First, they would like get stories from CCTV and CGTN and do the voiceover in Brazilian Portuguese. At some point, they had reporters, Chinese reporters speaking Portuguese reporting news. This completely changed how Bungie covers China. Pablo Morales, this guy that I just mentioned, and Paulo Menecheli, my good friend who wrote the afterword for my book, they actually analyzed thousands of stories on China, and they could verify as a fact that the coverage went to slightly negative to mostly positive. And I'm talking about a TV station. I think like here in the US, it's hard to understand this reach because I think like media laws, you prevent a channel from like being so big. Like Bungie covers 87% of Brazilian territory. It's the third, perhaps sometimes second biggest TV network in Brazil. So it is a big deal, and it went beyond news. When Bolsonaro was president of Brazil during the pandemic, one of his sons, Eduardo, who's by the way very good friends with Trump Jr., he tweeted that what China was doing about the pandemic was pretty much similar to what the Soviet Union did with, Jesus, like the name, Chernobyl, yeah. The Chinese ambassador was extremely offended by this, and he demanded the Brazilian government to issue an official apology to the Chinese people, etc., etc., etc. Same lingo that we see everywhere. But the fact that not only the Brazilian government apologized, but Bungie, this TV channel, they broadcast an editorial 3 minutes long calling Bolsonaro and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil stupid for picking up fights with China. And I went to Bungie for this book and I asked, why did you do this? Was that intentional? And they said very openly, yeah, we're trying to protect China. China is very important for Brazil. Catch. The owner of Bungie is one of the biggest agribusiness entrepreneurs in Brazil. And the way they started like this partnership was basically Bungie trying to do something very small so they would have a business card to present in China. Whenever they had like business, like the actual money where like agribusiness is, they would say, oh, you know, I also have like a TV station, we broadcast Chinese news. And I saw this in Argentina, I saw this in Chile, I saw this in Colombia, I saw this in Brazil. I didn't see this in Mexico, but I wouldn't question that this happens there as well. So like they're able to connect to businesses elites through this agreement. And I think like here in the US, people tend to oversight this and see, okay, this is not very relevant. And for us, like sort of like used to Western media, when you see the content, it's very bad in general. So like you tend to think, oh, no one is gonna like believe in this. Problem is, and this is something that I proved with my research, in 2020, I actually conducted a poll with 2,700 people in Brazil from different social classes and genders to see if they would be able to perceive when a content was produced by China and when it was produced by like independent media, and whether or not Chinese content with like a well-established local brand would increase credibility. And yes, the answer is yes. If they perceive that it comes from China, then they would like second guess about the whole thing. But like most of the times they cannot. So when I show them like a story, for example, like a snippet from this documentary that Global broadcasted on the pandemic, and I asked, okay, so this documentary was broadcasted by Global at X date, and after watching this, do you trust the news or not? And then most people would say, yes, I trust the news because they thought it was like a global production, not a CGTN production. And then I would ask, knowing that what you just saw is a production from Chinese state media, do you keep your answer, like your previous answer, do you still believe it or do you still distrust it? Most of them didn't say it was important. And then I did some focus groups with some people to understand, okay, like, you know that it's not produced by Global. Why do you still think it's trustworthy? And they basically say, well, if it is trustworthy for Global, and it is the channel that is being feeding me with news in the past like 50 years, so it should be true. They wouldn't broadcast something that is a lie. That's not always the case. I think there's this. And finally, yeah, this is the last topic that I'm gonna cover because otherwise I'll just keep talking and talking for an hour. A phenomenon that is very interesting is that in Mexico, Argentina, and Chile, many of these media executives, they say that they have been using Xinhua not only to publish content about China, but also content that Xinhua correspondents cover in Latin America. Because like they cannot afford to pay for Reuters, AFP, AP, it's very expensive. And sometimes, even if they do, there are certain countries where like Western journalists don't have access to. So like there is a specific case about a hurricane that destroyed like a city in Cuba. And there is this Chinese report to like CCTV media executives where they were very proud that like for a whole week, several channels in Latin America were basically using the Chinese piece on that because no one else has access to Cuba. Same thing in Venezuela, like they were the first ones to recognize the results of the election in Venezuela for a reason, right? So I think like in general, this is what I had to talk. I had other stuff too, but I will leave it to discussions.
Fascinating, thank you.
Okay, great. Well, very, very interesting. So a couple of comments and then we can open it up. So one thing it just strikes me that China, as many other countries, has been promoting Chinese values, Chinese culture, always, right? So in the 60s and 70s, the US had China Reconstructs and Beijing Review and these kinds of publications, as well as Soviet Life, right, from the Soviet Union. So it's not a new thing.
It's not even a communist thing. That's not during the Republican era, actually.
Well, and we have Voice of America, and we have programs like Fulbright, and we have, so it's at that level, it's seems very legit and the normal thing to do. Interestingly, in 1976, I went on one of those trips to China with bookstores that were selling the books and periodicals from China. So I have a little experience of being taught what it is like, right? This is what China's like, but we had meetings with the editorial boards of these different publications. And they truly wanted to know, so what are Americans interested in? We want to put together content that they would enjoy and that they would actually.
Cultural Revolution?
Well, this was 1976, so it was the very end of the Cultural Revolution. But it's sort of very similar kinds of puzzling, how can we share what's going on in China with the world, right? So that has just continued. From what I understand from your research, it's a lot more intense, it's a lot more funded, it's a lot more, it's just a lot larger and paying more attention to Central Asia, for example, and Latin America and all. But I wonder in that context, to what extent are the biggest changes in this approach from China? Both from the results side, and you can talk about the weaknesses there too, but also from the Chinese side, like the institutions within China that manage the media, right? So we have, of course, we have Xinhua and People's Daily and CGTN, but behind that, we have the information office of the state council, and we have the propaganda department. Is that the same as it was in the 60s and 70s or 80s, or has it gone up in terms of priority in China and power? But, and that may vary by region. So I would just open it up to that, to all three of you.
Do you want to start?
I know that our students, a couple of our students are leaving because they have class. So I just
Okay.
wanted to, I know they're a little worried about exiting. So
Oh,
they have a PhD seminar or they cannot miss, so they're going to be heading out. But they listened and they might get in touch with the speakers if they had questions.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
For
See you.
So the question about the biggest changes, right? Abbos, do you want to start? Okay, very polite. I think, well, there are several changes maybe worth noting. One of them, I think, is localization of China's outreach in the media space. So we heard quite a lot about it from all the speakers, I think, but especially Igor brought up so many different ways in which this very sophisticated kind of complex localization schemes taking place. I think one of the localization examples is just the storytellers are becoming more localized as well. We have a lot of storytellers, or not we, but Chinese media that are hired from global South countries, and they're oftentimes exceptional journalists just get paid better or they have more stable jobs. So they get to poach really talented people, and I think that's something that sometimes we also in Western media, Western context, don't quite pay attention to. It's like, oh, Chinese media is just, they're telling their stories. Like, well, the storytellers are not always Chinese.
First-hand experience,
Yeah.
the salary can be very tempting.
Okay, salary is tempting. So
Yeah.
Igor can tell us juicy details about how that works.
Yeah.
But I didn't know about how salary ranges, but I heard that it's more stable at times.
It's usually double the other.
A double,
place.
wow,
Yeah,
okay,
because
that's
they know otherwise no one would choose to end their career with that.
And is it also more stable, like in terms of
Yeah.
Western media, you often worry about getting fired or
Yeah.
losing the job, but Chinese media seems like more.
As long as you shut up and you do what they want.
Okay.
Yeah.
As long as you're complicit, I guess.
But to what
Yeah.
extent, this
Yeah.
is what we all journalists do in every newsroom. So for many people, it's about stability and also the financial gains that you can get out of this.
Yeah.
Some can even think, okay, so I'm gonna do this for maybe 2 or 3 years, make some savings, and then go for my next job. But it's very hard to give up on a big salary, right? Once you're
Yeah.
selling.
I mean, I definitely noticed that also interviewing Xinhua journalists, Ethiopian journalists who worked for Xinhua for many years, and they found it to be a very stable, lucrative job, but they also get a lot of new equipment and training and just all kinds of exposure, travels that they wouldn't get in a Western news outlet that's barely hiring. And of course, Western media is shrinking its global exposure. And I think Igor just talked about the fact that some of these stories are being broken by Chinese media because they actually have access to some of these countries more than Western media, but also there's just fewer foreign correspondents. It's like the whole industry is shrinking. So I think that's something that sometimes also gets overlooked. It's like, well, China is doing its thing, but in part, the West is also kind of cutting down on its investments in just global journalism, essentially. So I think that part to me is fascinating. I think the other part of localization is this content sharing agreements that I didn't know about the Latin American context and this agribusiness connection and just how widespread they are. But I think also the study you did with kind of focus groups and the poll, right, asking people to differentiate which one is it. I think that's just really interesting. Like, do people actually know that Chinese media is being inserted or it's Chinese story told by Chinese state outlet that's actually appearing in a local news outlet that's very influential? I think that's like a fascinating trend. We need more research about that across the regions we're studying. I didn't do quite as big of a poll as you did, but with focus groups and asking people whether they recognize Chinese media, that was something I was asking. Like, I would tell them different names, and Some of them, most of them recognize Tsinghua, but they have their own pronunciation locally. But they said, "Oh, I recognize it." I said, "You read? You go on the website?" I said, "No, no. We never access Tsinghua directly, but we see it being quoted in local media. So it's just like its known recognition is raised only through local media. So again, it's kind of this localization tactic. So I think there's a lot more to say about that. But to me, that's the biggest trend that's in favor of Chinese, I guess, reach when it comes to the media.
So in Central Asia, observed some interesting moments. First of all, China tried to adapt his media policy due to internal conditions. So how he can more closer to Central Asia? First of all, they know about language barriers. So China language not popular, and it's very hard language to study, and not our most part of our population know Chinese language. Only some small part is like scholars who are more focused on China studies, they know Chinese language. But most part of the population don't know. That's why China tried to share his information, the content, through our media local media platforms. So they spread his information in Russian language, which is our native languages, in Uzbek, Kazakh, or Russian, which is more known internal conditions.
Did they also spread it in Uzbek or it's all Russian?
Yeah,
Also
in
Uzbek?
Uzbek.
Oh,
In two languages. In my country, in two languages, in Uzbek and Russian. One information, immediately they spread in two languages, in Uzbek and Russian. And such the way they improve his knowledge about China. And second part is very activities by Chinese diplomats. They organize not only the event, they also translate China information, China modernization, China ideology, China, some kind of initiatives into our native languages. They spread whole over the participant these events.
Like brochures or like
Brochures, it's not brochures, it's monographies.
Oh, like books,
it's
actual
books also. So
so they're preparing the materials.
several of them I also take.
Just in case.
So and also very interesting thing is organizing. It's increasing organizers by China side press tours for our journalists, for our scholars. Interesting is if they organize one tour, included not only journalists, they also include maybe one or two scholars also. Because scholars, it's another level. Journalists is another level. They also want to gather two main factors who can spread, who are available to spread more information about China. And China.
You went on a tour, right?
Yeah, I'm also.
He was also
participate.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
China diplomats also organize some kind of competitions. It's for local levels. So on China information, when China was created as China People Republic, when China established independence, when China established bilateral relations, Uzbekistan with China. So through this way, they give more information to know about China, more knowledge about China. And also in Kazakhstan case, it's very important also, because in Uzbekistan, before, during the more than 30 years, they haven't any negative information on the media platform, because our media official platforms control this situation. Negative information on our Telegram channels, maybe Facebooks, about Xinjiang situation. But in Kazakhstan, it's another situation. They have also negative information all over the media platforms, and also positive. But last 2 years, after many steps, many approaches by China side to increase his image, they can reach this positive image. Because last 2 years, positive information become more than negative information.
Kazakhstan.
In Kazakhstan case, yeah. Because it's China create several platforms. First, before pandemic, they create Belt and Road platform, which is include only scholars, sinologists, who focused on China issues. After pandemic, they create China Studies alumni. This young youth of Kazakh youth who studied in China universities. This platform also spreads so many information about China. How can study in China? How is situation internal in China? How is more important to study in China? So it's kind of so many information. When I analyzed this information, I found more than 100 information about China. So last platform is they created in 2023. It's the center of searching China modernization. There's also very good platform through what China increased his media image. It's a positive image. They also tells more about China modernization process. How is important for Central Asian countries to implement this modernization processes. So through these ways, they increase his image and they increase more knowledge about China. It's also more important. So such kind of methods they last years use.
Very, very detailed, very interesting. Igor, some?
I just want to highlight like a few things here. Like, so as I mentioned before, like this push to try to show China has, it really is. It didn't start with the communists. In fact, you have like papers and like speeches back in like the early 1900s of like nationalists from the Kuomintang saying basically, well, the West doesn't understand us. We have to do something about it. So in a way, I think like this is not very different from like what they tried to do back then. I also would like to, you asked when did it start like to become a big thing, right? Like, I feel that like during the Cold War, the Chinese media, they were mostly focused on exporting their content to other like red countries. After the end of the Cold War, not so much. Jiang Zemin eventually implemented some reforms to make news a commodity, meaning they could like follow market rules. But the real like push in terms of like money and strategy to go global, it started after the Olympics in 2008. And it's important to highlight this here because like the reason why they did it was because like they spent so much money and like they were like ready to throw this show and show the world that China was back. And then suddenly every single media outlet around the world was talking was the protest for like the Tibetans, right? Like you had like the torch relay being interrupted several times. And okay, you cannot expect that something like this will happen and the Western media is not going to cover it. But like, I have to say, because I checked back some of the coverage from that time, and there was a lot of racism in this coverage from Western media. CNN had to apologize for using very derogatory terms. So eventually they were like, well, it doesn't matter how much money we spend, they're never going to trust us, they're never going to understand us if we don't control the narrative. And that's when you start like seeing more and more investment going all the way into Xi Jinping gives out like the famous speech telling the China story as well. Whether like what configures like a good story, what is telling the China story well, it's a matter for debate. And there is a whole section of my book dedicated to this. I don't think there is like, even within China, I don't think they understand and there is consensus on like what narratives they consider like positive to put it out there. And that means like from time to time, even these media outlets, they were like designed for foreign audiences, they would be targeted by censorship. That's the case, for example, with Six Stone, a very good website in Shanghai that is state media. I was actually quite surprised to discover that they were state media because it's very independent, really well written, but yeah, they were basically forced to fire half of the personnel after the pandemic because eventually the way they were covering the pandemic became like a problem for Shanghai local officials. And then another thing that I have to mention about this, and I'll try to be brief, but it's not like Latin Americans or for this matter, like Africans or Central Asians, they don't understand that content in China is controlled, right? There is genuine interest in this sort of content. And don't get me wrong, but like, I think coverage of China here in the US or in Europe is not always objective either. So the way like many media executives that I spoke to, they frame this as like, we understand it's censored, but like showing their side is also important, right? The problem here is that like, okay, you can show their side, but you have to counter the narrative when they're actually spreading disinformation or fake news. And you don't have journalists in these newsrooms with the knowledge and the expertise to talk about this. In nearly every media outlet I visited for the field research of this book, there was no Chinese speaker. Most of people, like, they would write about China, but they also would write about like all the other regions in the world because like the international desk is just a fraction of these newspapers, and it's very expensive because imagine like a reporter that can speak Chinese, English, Spanish, French. It costs more.
That's a lot.
So yeah, so like very rarely, matter of fact, only at Folha de São Paulo newspaper I worked for, and yeah, I think it was only at Folha. We had like someone dedicated to talk about China. Global has one too, but that's the correspondent, Marcelo Nini. And when I think about it, like this is slowly changing in Brazil. I think like after the pandemic, people finally realized that like, okay, this is a topic we cannot ignore. I feel like before the pandemic, going to China and like pursuing my master's there, like the 2 degrees, it was sort of like betting on a future because I knew it was going to be important and I had like some sort of exposure to China, but I never imagined it would happen so fast. I think like after the pandemic, there was such like a big demand, and like at some point, like I had at least 4 different media outlets reaching out asking for content, and I could choose which one to collaborate with. And this is good from like a personal perspective, but at the same time, it's very sad because we know that like this gap is being filled with propaganda, this gap is being filled with disinformation. And the biggest problem of all is that like, how do you tackle this issue without incurring censorship? Because I'm confident that the Brazilian government right now, if they try to regulate this issue, I don't think they would like actively try to censor Chinese media. But I'm not so sure if Bolsonaro was still the president, you know? I don't know about a president like in the near future that could be like, has anti-China, has like Javier Milei in Argentina, might try to, I don't know, to expel the Chinese from Brazil or prevent Brazilians to have access to some of these Chinese narratives. I don't think that's the answer. I think the answer really is to try to fund these newspapers, to help these journalists acquire the knowledge and the expertise to cover, not in the way the US or the West wants them to cover China, but through their own lenses, you know? Like, I think, I do agree with many people at Congress when I talk to them and they mention China as a national security concern. I think China is indeed a national security concern for the US, but that's not the case in Brazil. Like, matter of fact, China for us is an option because like, while the US has been demanding more stuff and providing very little, China was there, you know? Like, last week, I was in a meeting with Jake Sullivan, and he mentioned that like quite often when he goes to Africa or South America, people say that China has a checkbook, the US has a checklist. There's a reason for why people say that, right? Like, and this is not only about media, I think it's about like how politics in general work here. So like something that I've been advocating, and I actually like proposed this to someone at the State Department that I met last week, is that like the US has a big tradition in bringing journalists from other parts of the world to have internships here. And budget for this kind of initiative, it's like getting cut like every year. Like, for example, like every election they used to bring like a huge delegation from Brazil to cover the elections here from different sides, like different perspectives. This year they only had budget to bring 1.
Wow, that's crazy.
So like, I mean, if you could like perhaps like set a budget, not to spread anti-China propaganda throughout Latin America, because I don't think it's going to get us anywhere. Matter of fact, it's going to like raise distrust not only on China but also on the U.S. It's not like we are not used to this kind of stuff. But if you could bring these journalists to perhaps like have an internship with the China desk of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, for them to see, for example, how a journalist outside of China is accessing information, how they are connected to sources that you learn through practice, you know, and then when they go back, they're going to be the ones like doing this, but also telling their colleagues how to do it as well. And eventually you build a community. It can be very isolating sometimes doing this in Brazil because most journalists focusing on China in Brazil, they're like left-wing leaning journalists, people that work for like partisan media outlets. And it feels very isolating because both sides hate me, you know? It's like, how dare you talk about China and you're not a communist? And on the other side too, like if you like compliment China or something, or if you praise something that you're doing that could be like perhaps like used in Brazil too, like poverty alleviation programs, for example, people would call you a panda hugger, saying that like you're like supporting a dictatorship. No, I'm just doing my job, you know, and I think my goal is not to, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think what we're doing here is very important and discussing this issue is like the first step. But my goal is that for like those like barely, people that can barely read in Brazil, my goal is for them to, perhaps when they go to the bakery and the bread is more expensive, they would be able to make the connection that perhaps the bread is more expensive because we are exporting the commodities to China. You know, I want normal people to understand the impact that these relationships have on their lives. It's the biggest trading partner we have. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think like for the US, because like we are geographically and culturally closer, this relation, this correlation is much easier, but with China, not so much. And that concerns me. It concerns like what the effect this is gonna take like on our democracy, the way we see the world, and on our political system. We already have people like supporting the Chinese political system and style. Like that's definitely not something I wanna see, not in Brazil, not in Latin America, and in general, not in the world. Yeah. So that's why I think this topic is so important.
Yeah. Good point. Well, we don't have a lot of time left, but questions?
Sorry. Igor, you talked about this some. Although I believe your example on effectiveness, you were like, do you trust this documentary or not? You were talking about a documentary that you said was quite good anyway, right?
Yes.
So yeah, okay.
But that's not, the documentary wasn't the only snippet I showed people.
Sure.
There was also reportings made by Chinese reporters, CGTN reporters in Portuguese.
So in the West, when we talk about the media, I believe there's this sort of like quasi-liberal, quasi-biblical belief that they shall know the truth and the truth shall set them free, right? Which is, you've got to be an idiot to believe that in America. An absolute idiot to believe that access to the truth means anything. Don't you? I mean, don't you think like half the American population thinks that the current sitting president stole the election? Do you know what I mean? Like it means nothing, right? So there's nothing about, let's say if all of this were, let's say it's all misinformation. There's nothing about it being misinformation that's particularly convincing. Let's say all of it is accurate. There's nothing about all of it being accurate that is there's just nothing convincing about information or misinformation. There's always something else. And again, I said to you because you talked about it, but I'm interested in what the other, Maria and Abbos have to say. This has been a very supply side conversation, right? Is it effective? Does it work? Because I could watch Fox News all day. I could only have access to Fox News and Fox News and People's Daily for the rest of my life, and I wouldn't believe it.
But that's because you have your preconceptions already.
Yeah.
For many of these people,
Everyone
they are
does,
a blank canvas. They know nothing about China, so whatever they feed them, they're going to believe.
Everyone does. So the question is, if this is effective, why is it effective? Is it that they know nothing? Is it and I'm just going to give away my own suspicion. Every single one of you has talked about how much development money China is giving these places, right? I mean, Abbos, from your interview with us, sorry to plug it, but I use this quote a lot. 2000 to 2022, Uzbeki-China trade increased by 78.5 times. right? 9.5 million to, what is the figure, 7.5 million. Huge, right?
Yeah.
Is that why this is it effective? Is that why? Is there another reason?
Maybe should we collect a couple? I think John had his hands. Maybe we collect a couple of.
A couple of questions.
Yeah.
My take on this, comments go in a different direction. From that, if you're stay here, I'll come back. China's periphery is surrounded by tracts of territory which China claims should be part of China. Historically, we're part of China and we're stolen from China by imperialism. And it's time for these to return to China's rule. This is Xi Jinping's philosophy. The South China Sea should be China. Taiwan should be incorporated into China. Mongolia was historically part of China. From Xi Jinping's perspective, as he's laid it out since became paramount leader, it's time for China to be restored to the paramount position in Asia, East Asia. And for the United States to recognize that and go home. I guess my question is for Central Asia, which has been under Russian protection from China for a long time. And going back to the Taiping Rebellion in China, one of the reasons the Chinese ignored what the British were along the coast of the treaty system was because they were trying to keep the Turkic peoples in Xinjiang, the Mongolian peoples in Xinjiang under control. They were coming from threatening China from a different vector. It seemed more dangerous to China's elite than the European barbarians who came by ships on the coast. But now China is becoming China again, and it's time for Taiwan to become part of China, the South China Sea to become part of China, and China's becoming a major naval power, the Navy larger than the United States. And this is rooted in China's culture and belief that China must have sea domination to ensure that its exports and imports have free access. Mahan's philosophy of navalism. So this is modern navalism of Anglo-American invention is now being adopted by China. And China's become the dominant sea power in Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean.
Dr. Garber, we don't have much more time, so.
So from a Central Asian perspective, from a Kazakh perspective, or an Uzbek perspective, would they rather be the peoples of those the peoples of those regions, either the Muslim peoples or the secular people or Russians? Would they be part of a Russian realm or a Chinese realm?
Any other quick questions to add? Yes, Delma?
So I really enjoyed the talk. I have more like a clarification question. So it seems to me that content sharing is a major way that China get to tell its story. But is that the content sharing is limited to only stories about China, or where they simply cannot get any story from those countries, or it also sort of like are about more contentious issues like Ukraine war, because we know the U.S. its allies find it's in a difficult situation to sell its story to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world seems to be accepting the story China and Russia trying to tell them. Is that this content sharing play any part in
Good
that
question.
conception?
Yes, please.
So just a quick question. In terms of like the media trainings that China offers in Latin America and Central Asia. I'm just curious, do we know like the details of these trainings? Do they contain like practical or technical information, or it's just purely ideological?
All right, panelists?
I think maybe we can take a couple of minutes just to answer whatever we can,
Yeah.
whatever anybody wishes to answer.
Yeah.
So I want to give more space to Abbos and Igor, but just a couple of points on the responses. I think the effectiveness question, I did talk quite a bit actually about effectiveness in my remarks, so I don't think it was really supply-driven conversation. I think all of us mentioned it to some extent, but effectiveness is always very hard to measure. It depends what are we looking at. Are we looking at journalists or the media, which is what I talked about? Are we looking at the public at large, the society, how they're reacting to the media? It depends which segment that we're actually looking at. And I think if you look at it from communication studies, also perspective, which coming from the communication department here, media effects theories have been largely kind of disproven. The idea that the media can just like single-handedly affect perceptions, that's been disproven all across the board in the West. So, the consensus I think in the literature on media effects is that at best these effects are partial, and they always layer upon various pre-existing perceptions, but also many other channels of information. Right, this person going to the bakery might have information from their relatives or whatever else they're consuming from the institution, from their colleagues, and also from the media. So there's all kinds of different channels. Media is only one of them. And as you mentioned, believe in the very much misinformation, disinformation kind of reality. So who knows what matters anymore? Of course, that's a very, the question, that the meta question, right? But philosophical questions.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into that. But I think when it comes to perceptions, just on the kind of societal level, the studies that we do have, including you mentioned Lu Morales' work, but also the work of scholars who study perceptions in Africa, at the societal level, they tend to find that the effects are very limited. So people do tend to be very skeptical of Chinese media, Chinese storytelling coming from Chinese media, and in general of China at large. Even in countries like Ethiopia that tend to be very pro-China, supposedly, people are not buying into the idea that China is a benevolent partner, that it's pro-pro, it's win-win. All those kind of narratives are being widely disputed at the level of unofficial, informal kind of communication. So people, word of mouth, social media, discover the debates that are not part of the official spectrum, people tend to really doubt, contest, and resent China. And they often use humor, like satire, humor, and rumors as a way to do that. So I write about this also in my book manuscript, that it's not a direct kind of resentment, but it's oftentimes through jokes, through rumors. People try to kind of poke fun at and challenge these narratives, but sometimes producing also disinformed accounts. So, prison labor is a rumor. That's just an example that, people that I spoke to, from elites to general public, would often talk about how Chinese companies bring prison labor, right, from prisons. And they would ask me, like, are they coming from prisons? It's like, well, there's no proof that they are. I mean, these are just workers coming from China. Some of them, they really want to just make money, right? And there's many studies about their kind of motivations to come to China. And I haven't seen a single study that argues and finds that they're prisoners. But the rumor is there, and it's become a belief. People actually buy into it, say, of course they're prisoners, because they work 7 days a week. They don't come out of the compounds. It looks like China's just exporting its prison labor. So, in a way, this kind of storytelling is often contested at this kind of popular, level. And of course, if you think about authoritarianism at large as a system, there's always contestation. There are always rumors. There's always satire. There's always creative ways to kind of rethink what's being offered to you. So I guess, I'm a believer that there are always multiple ways to make meetings, and that people will find ways to kind of create their own layered understanding of China. And as Igor mentioned, it's good to inform more and create a more balanced, more deep understanding. And my worry is also that there's just not enough knowledge production from on the ground, right? Whether it's South America or Central Asia or Africa, I think we just need more experts, journalists, and other voices that are telling their own stories of China. They don't have to be Western-centric stories. They don't have to be American perspectives at all. Their own stories. How do they see it? What are their concerns? What are their perceptions? And I think that's where there's a real shortage. And that investment is necessary, but where does it come from? I'm not sure, but that's something that I'm thinking about a lot as I wrap up this research in my own space, my own field.
Let me just add to something you mentioned. Yes, I do agree that like media alone is not like capable of changing, like single-handedly, like changing perspectives on a specific issue or country or whatever. So first of all, like just to address your question directly, it's hard to it's like asking what comes first, the egg or the chicken, right? Like to some extent, yes, it is successful because like China is important, but like to what extent, like it's only like important because there is need for like information from China, precisely because China is important,
It's all interconnected.
Yeah, so it's hard to answer this, but like you mentioned about recent research showing that it's not effective. Actually, like there is this research that I mentioned. You can find it later. It's on page 52. It was like a very robust study conducted by Harvard, Yale, and another Dutch university. I cannot pronounce the name. But they basically compared like more than 19,000 CDCN stories through about like 1,000, 1,100 or whatever videos from Voice of America, Share America, and other videos produced by like State Department affiliated media outlets. And here are some things that they found. Like, and this was like in the selected like countries in the global south. And some of the conclusions were, and this was like a study published last year, by the way. Exposure to message from Chinese state media that commend the high performance of the Chinese government can effectively generate support for China's economic and political model. Considering the limited reach of Chinese state media, exposure to new information about China is more likely to shift international public opinions toward China beliefs and values than information about the United States. When faced with conflicting messages from democratic and autocratic countries, the audience tends to favor the autocratic model. State media from authoritarian regimes tend to be more successful in developing countries. And finally, Chinese state media offers a fresh perspective on China and are thus particularly effective in boosting approval for the Chinese government, even though they fall short of convincing people of its democratic nature.
I just wanted to add one thing about this study because I did read it, and it's an experiment-based study. So basically, people are watching a video and they have to react in real time, and sometimes they're paid to react. They actually paid the fee to participate in the study. And my concern with the method is that, you know, it's just impossible to believe for me that somebody after watching a video will significantly change your perception of a whole country. So it's very much like capturing a moment in time. Like you watch a video, how do you feel about China now? You compare. So it has its
not even like on Chinese media. It's a comparison between Chinese media and US media.
So I'm just imagining like all of us sitting there and like we're being asked to watch a video about China or the US. And we'll say, okay, yeah, I mean, the story sounds credible. It sounds like China is very accomplished. And I do think that China is successful in certain ways because I watched the story. But then does it really reshape fundamentally how you think about China? But it isn't, you know, it's just an interesting way to think about how do we measure effectiveness. And this study suggests that's the way to do it. I think it has merit because it's very large scale. It gives us a lot of data. And it seems like there's something to it in terms of immediate shift, like, you know, maybe.
And I think it's not conclusive, right? But I think it's a sign.
It's a sign, but it's something that also is like questioning again as we think about effectiveness. How do we get to it? How do we get to the effectiveness? If we do it through these experiments, I guess my personal opinion or professional opinion is that it's a little misleading, but at the same time, it does give us some kind of snippet at what's possible. So maybe, you know, if more and more people are exposed over time, constantly, maybe they do become more and more, you know, impressed by it.
Just to answer your question very fast because we don't have much time. So like I think like from what I heard, I don't know if that's the case for journalists in Central Asia or Africa, but I would assume the programs are like similar. It's actually a useful program. Like they do learn the preferred like talking points from the CCP. So whenever like they are studying about Chinese like contemporary history or politics, there's not much room there for like opposition or like to any sort of like second views on specific stuff. But they also learn how to operate a camera, how to use AI, how to leverage AI to improve your content, or how to use like the latest technology in broadcasting. So it's not like, I don't think anyone would like leave your job in your country, in your culture, in your language to go all the way to China, to the other side of the world, and just sit in a classroom for 9 months, like getting propaganda, you know? So like they go because there is genuine value. It's just a matter of like, okay, to what extent they're applying more like what they learned on in terms of like expertise on how to use this kind of tools, and to what extent they're also drawing from what they learn and what they learn alone on China to write reportings when they come back to countries. I spoke to some people who went, I would say that like, especially in Mexico and Argentina, most of the journalists I spoke to, they were very skeptical about China. So they knew what they were going to get, and they're willing to go just because they thought it would be like a nice experience and like going to a new country, a new culture, but that didn't change.
You always learn something.
Yeah.
So there was one case.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, well, okay, that's a good opportunity. I'm gonna go. But yeah, so from time to time, you do get like journalists who become like panda huggers. Matter of fact, I was targeted by one of them who was invited to go to China during the pandemic to cover the Party Congress. During the coverage, she was like scouting this journalist from the UK telling him that Taiwan is indeed part of China. And then when she came back to Brazil, a journalist that used to cover fashion now covers China. And she has a blog to basically criticize and expose anyone that does anything related to China as like a tool of US propaganda. That's how she framed me when I worked with the Freedom House to come up with a training course, a very short, it wasn't even a course, it was a workshop for journalists in Brazil interested in China. And you could see that like she's pretty much drawing from Chinese talking points.
Abbos will give you the last word.
Yeah. About effectiveness, yeah, I also agree. There are so many facts which is proven effectiveness. It also has so many factors which is proof non-effective. So I would like to highlight two main factors why effective China's media in Central Asia. So firstly, most journalists which are taught, which are discussed this issue, they all said me this China information, it's as an alternative Western and Russian information channels. And so they have a huge demand to inform, to read information about several information channels, not only Western, not only from Russia. They also would like to see what China mind about this one case, maybe about Ukraine crisis. What China think about that, or what China think about situation in Central Asia, maybe some cases in January, problems in Kazakhstan, maybe some problem riots in Uzbekistan, some problems, territorial problems in Tajikistan between Kyrgyzstan. So we have a demand what China think about this alternative resource of information. It's the first fact. Second factor is that China more softer than Western media channels, rather than Russian. Softer. They don't pressure. They don't try to teach something. They don't try to say something. It's our last point. It's true point. It's a trustable information. No, they said it's our point of view. How you think? It's your mind. It's very so far, through not pressure, so not teaching our people. So they trying to spread this information very soft way. So it's two factors about details, tours, press tours, maybe some kind of another training programs. So they tried two main factors. Firstly, to increase knowledge about China. They, during these trainings, during this press tours, they tried to inform more about China culture, more about China huge cultural heritage, historicals. They try to teach us China has a more than 5,000 years history, it's long-term period, big history and huge history, so like this. And second main important fact is most our journalists, I was surprised at this, from 11 journalists which I talked, 9 changed his mind about China. More positive one, more positive. They, when I asked from them, would you like to go China again? From 11, 2 said negative, 9 said, of course, I would like many times go there. So yeah. So why? And from 9, 3 or 4 of them create his own internet website, Telegram channels, which is mostly informed about China.
Wow.
They create his own websites and Telegram channels on China. it's several informations. It's about tourism, about culture, about China economic development, so on, so on. So 9 journalists changed his mind about China.
Pretty good.
Only 2 stayed not negative, because 2 of them, it's a high officials. In our country has some kind of point among our scholars. In official list, we have a good and very warm relations, but social level, it's cold relations. And main point of view, China never become cultural huge power in Central Asia because we have a very different cultures. Never become, because who our exports in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and another who Central Asian countries, scholars and journalists also point that China never become huge cultural power in Central Asia. Maybe they become economic, they become political huge power, but not in cultural way.
So interesting. All right, maybe we should
Shall
stop
we
there.
thank them?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for moderating.
Yeah.
All righty, to the 5 of you still watching at home, good night and good luck.
Good luck.